It is my great pleasure to introduce our first plenary speaker, Dr. Helen Beattie. Helen Beattie is a vet with a remarkably diverse career, spanning clinical practice, involvement in the UK's foot and mouth response, ownership of practices, motherhood, educating veterinary nurses, serving as an animal welfare inspector for shelter vets for the SPCA, and now leading as the NZVA's Chief Veterinary Officer. So now she is the Managing Director of Veterinarians for Animal Welfare, Aotearoa. Hopefully I got the pronunciation correct there in the Māori. And Helen channels her passions for animal welfare advocacy and education, driving transformative change in animals' lives. So today Helen's going to talk to us about farm animal welfare, wickedness, and why it stymies progress, where she's going to talk about complex barriers hindering the implementation of animal welfare science, with a focus particularly on farm animals and a role for One Health, One Welfare and a Te Ao Māori approach. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Helen Beattie.
Thank you, Matt. Just see if I can get my screen share done in the right order now. Yes, okay, so that looks good to me. Does that look good to you?
It does, yep, perfect.
Excellent, great. Thank you for those introductory remarks and also your introduction, Alan. There were several things in what you just said that were making my heart sing, like diverse groups of people coming together, the wide stakeholder list that you gave, and things around communication, and all of that I'm about to dive into here. Okay, so wickedness and why it stymies progress. I would add that it's not just for animals that it stymies progress, but that's going to be our focus for today. So here's my best attempt with my Māori pronunciation, Matt, and you can judge me after this one. So tēnā koutou katoa, ko mani atoto te Papatūānuku, ko te noho auki o te Pōteanaine, I raro I te maru o te kaitahu, ko te Mānaurawa, ko Ingarihi te iwi, ko Beattie te hapu, ko Aotearoa, ko Barbara Helen tokohua, nō rewa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I acknowledge ngā iwi o Māori is the tangata whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and their rich contribution to society, and I pay my respects to elders, past and present and future leaders, and extend that respect to other Indigenous peoples present here today. So good morning, morena. That's a traditional, or rather shortened version of a traditional Māori version. Welcome. As Matt said, I'm Helen, and I'm the Managing Director of that very long name that we shorten to VAWA, which is much easier, and you don't have to worry about the pronunciation of Aotearoa when you say it that way. So VAWA works really well. And I'm really delighted to be here speaking to you today about one of my favourite things, which is wickedness. I'm known for liking reasonably provocative language, and wickedness as a word when we talk about animal welfare does tend to upset people. That's not my intention, but hopefully it captures your attention. Okay, so I had two things else I wanted to say in my introduction before I move on. One is that I will forewarn you that this is a bit of a meandering journey, but bear with me because I promise you I will get to, at the end, why wickedness stymies progress for animals. So let's dive in. I'm delighted to be here and I look forward to your questions at the end. So I can't see the audience. Maybe someone can give me some feedback. I was going to ask how many people already know about wicked problems. I will bypass that and assume that many don't. It's something I stumbled across about, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, and I really think it's hugely influential in why we get stuck on a number of things, including progress for animals. So this is a screenshot of VAWA's website, and as you can see, it's front and centre there on our website, and we're very mindful of this as a dynamic in the work that we do. I believe it's a strong driver and controller of some of the biggest challenges that we face in our use here in New Zealand, but I suspect that applies internationally as well in our use and engagement of animals. And I guess one of the things that I'd really like to make sure we take away from today is that where wickedness exists, it's a system that has delivered it, and it's the system as I think about it, the whole supply chain. So from banks to territorial authorities that provide consents for land conversion, for example, to veterinarians and rural consultants through their advice to farmers, and through who we would call MPI here. So that's our ministry who's responsible for administering our Animal Welfare Act, but through their implementation of policy and I would argue lack of compliance action. But also it's society, right? Because social license matters. And if society as a whole doesn't speak up, then we are also complicit in a lack of progress. I don't think there's anyone that you can't point the finger at, and I'm suggesting we don't point the finger at anyone. So we'll come back to this later, but I just want to be really clear, although there's a lot of stuff here that's talking about farm systems and outcomes for animals, that I do not blame farmers for what I'm about to show you and talk to you about. So before we dive into that, I do want to set out why I think it's important and how things get made wicked in a quite a high level way, but hopefully reasonably simplistically, because if we can't understand this bit, then none of the rest makes sense. I don't think you're going to find this to be new thinking. I'm just not sure that you would have thought about it in relation to wickedness and animal welfare. Okay, so I just greeted you, and I did this via a mihi, which is, as I said, a Māori greeting, and that sets out who I am and where I come from. So land is central to our identity as a people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We talk about our tūranga waiwai, the place where we stand, the place where our roots go down. And I would acknowledge also, although I can't speak for any other cultures, but I don't think this position or belief system is unique to Aotearoans. Many cultures and many people across the world have a similar recognised relationship to the land and actually to the wider natural world. As tangata whenua, so that's the Māori term for people of the land, it is recognised that Māori have a distinct and special connection to the land. And when introducing ourselves in line with tikanga or Māori protocol, the right way to do things, our mihi acknowledges not just the people of our family, but also we might talk about the canoe or the waka that people arrived in, or the place from whence we come. We might talk about our mountain that is in the area from where we came, our river or our tribe, or possibly all of the above. And for me as a Pākehā or a non-Māori, I would say I'm from Scotland and from England, which is kind of true, although don't get excited any of the Brits on the screen, because I don't really think I'm one of you. I very much feel like a Kiwi. This is my home. I don't actually feel any connection to what my grandmother would have called the homeland. Maybe 5 generations down the track, that's something that's eventually kind of been stamped out, not sure. But my tūranga waiwai is that red circle. So I live in the little pin drop on the right-hand side of that image, and I grew up within the circle in a pretty amazing piece of country called the Māori. So it's big open country, it's high country, extremely hot in the summer and extremely cold in the winter. It's a pretty brutal climate. And at this point you're going, this has got nothing to do with wickedness. As I said, hang in, we'll get there. So that's the hot days, that's the cold days, that's the village library. It's like the cutest library you're ever going to see. And this is the type of country where I grew up in, that we farmed in my family, which in New Zealand is quite a big thing. We've been there for about 120 years, which internationally is kind of nothing, but it's a bit of a big deal when most of the people in New Zealand settled here after Māori. We settled post 1800, so 100 years is kind of getting up there. And that's the top of the farm in the winter, so permafrost, which again, a number of you will have seen in various places from whence you come. So this is my tūranga waiwai, where I come from and my centre. Another concept I want you to become familiar with is te ao Māori. We heard Matt say that earlier. I'm not going to dive into this other than to say I'm not a scholar. This is not my space to speak within. I am a Pākehā New Zealander, but the way of thinking that comes with te ao Māori, which is all about connectedness, really resonates with me. I think it's a really sensible way of doing business. And I'm kind of a little bit envious that I don't have any whakapapa back to any iwi in this country. My kids do, but I do not. So Te Ao Māori, there's a whole big thing, as I say, not mine to talk to, but 3 basic pillars, which is Te Reo Māori, the language, Tikanga Māori, the protocols and customs, and then Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And many of you will have heard about our Treaty of Waitangi, which is a fairly unique document, even on an international stage. So I really like this short excerpt here, and this really ties back the idea about connectedness, which is, I'm going to then tie wickedness to, but about how the Māori worldview thinks about things. And the pink there says, Māori recognise the links between a healthy ecosystem, including its life-supporting food, and people's cultural and spiritual well-being. And the first part of the next sentence said something like, the people are, but not above nature, but a part of nature. Now, no one can argue with that, right? We know that that is true. However, at the same time, when you start listening for it, so many people talk about people and nature, you know, separating ourselves out. And I genuinely believe that that thinking is partly why we've got into these wicked messes that we are struggling to resolve. So some kupu, some words. We've talked about mihi, a greeting, tikanga, the right way to do things, Te Ao Māori, a Māori worldview. And as I noted, Māori consider that parts of the natural world are also part of their whakapapa, or what they would call, genealogy, which they would call whakapapa. And it's laid out there in the image. So that talks about that fact that whakapapa, or genealogy, links all animate and inanimate things, known and unknown, natural and spiritual world. It's a concept that binds far more than just people together. And when Māori talk about their whakapapa, they actually refer back and relate their genealogy back to natural resources. So they might talk about the mountain from where they came, etc., etc. Again, I think this is a lovely way of acknowledging that actually we are part of the natural world, right? Not separate to it. There's also several examples I can give you for Māori, and I'm sure the same exists in other Polynesian cultures, where language speaks to the connectedness of the natural world to our physical self. So in my opening mihi, I use the word Papatūānuku. Now, whenua means land, but it also means placenta. And I think it's a lovely way of thinking about things where those are both things that feed and sustain us, and the same word is used for both. So as I said, this way of thinking about things, it just makes sense to me. We're not separate from the natural world. We're part of it, and we owe our very existence to her, Papatūānuku, a beautiful Māori word for Mother Earth. And I think, you know, irrespective of where you come from or necessarily who you are in a country or whatever, these concepts are important, and it certainly speaks to my own beliefs and values. But I'm focusing on this for another reason, because our land and the impacts that we have on it are highly relevant to the conversation about wickedness, that not only stymies progress for animals, but also, given the interconnectedness of all things, it directly impacts on people and onto our environment. So how do we, as scientists, Westerners and non-Indigenous people, how do we think about this? As I said before, I don't think these concepts that I'm going to talk to you about very briefly now to set up the framework for wickedness are going to be new. I guarantee everyone in this meeting has heard about One Health, One Welfare. And you can Google all of these, obviously. Google's got all the answers these days. But I did go back and have a look, because I presented on this earlier this year, and I wasn't actually sure about the year that the idea of One Health was originally posited, and it turns out it was around about 2004. So there's a website, the One Health Commission, that has some information about that. Now, it does say One Health is not a new concept, but it can be demonstrated that its origins and development literally run the gamut from A to Z, from Aristotle to ubiquity. And it goes on to talk about ecosystems, animal and people and the connections of them. Then a little bit later on, whoops, should have clicked my button, apologies. We find something else on One Health, which says that says One Health is an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. It recognises the health of humans domestic and wild animals, plants in the wider ecosystem are linked and interdependent. Great, I'm not going to argue with that. I think it's a really good way of looking at things. However, though I'm not an expert, it sounds a bit familiar and very similar to something that's been around quite a lot longer than 2004. So moving forward a little bit, up pops One Welfare. And, you know, I would have to argue I probably like it a bit more than One Health, because I'm a quasi-animal welfare scientist, and health I see as a subsidiary of welfare. And I'm a veterinarian, so animal welfare is my gig. So I'm kind of in the One Health team, sort of, except for what I'm about to say. But it kind of speaks to me a little bit more, I guess, than the One Health idea. And in an article in Viewpoint in the American Veterinary Medical Association journal back in 2016, we find a statement which says it is similar in a similar way to the relationship between animal and human health. There is a strong link between animal welfare and human well-being. I personally hate the word well-being. We could have a whole conference on that. The concept of One Welfare recognises the interconnections between animal welfare, human well-being, and the environment. Again, that's great. I love it. But I'm not an expert, but it sounds like something that's been around for quite a bit longer. So as I've noted, it's not actually my place to comment or be a scholar or an educator necessarily on Te Ao Māori. I'm not an expert, I'm not Indigenous. However, I do want to put it on the table here, because I look at this One Health, One Welfare conversation and think, there must be a whole bunch of Indigenous people across the world who kind of eye roll and go, oh, look at these new ideas. Not. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think it must be a little bit frustrating for Indigenous people thinking that there's been these new and clever ideas, when actually they've been around for a very, very long time. Okay, so all of that said, if there was the bottom line for me, interconnectedness, irrespective of the framework through which you think about it, is undeniable. The world is a connected place. VAWA's tagline is a good life for all. Now, as animal welfare people with an interest in animal welfare, you will know what a good life is. The for all piece for us is a reference to that idea that you simply can't create a good life for an animal without having impacts on the environment and the people around it. So what we should be striving for is joined up policy and thinking around these things, so we don't create perverse outcomes which become wicked problems. So don't fuss about the details. Think about it as a joined up approach, if there's a bottom line. Now, saying that, there was one thing I just wanted to be slightly provocative about. So I watched this great webinar from Paul McGreevy talking about One Welfare, and in it he noted and spoke about Mellor's 5 domains. We feel very proud about David Mellor and Camry down here in New Zealand, given he was they were the founders of the 5 domains, and David taught me at university. Kate, you might be in a similar position. So in McGreevy's talk, and when he was discussing the 5 domains, he talked about Mellor's flexibility regarding progress on the 5 domains model. And I thought that was a really nice way of looking at it. Or in the law, we would talk about taking an ambulatory approach. So things develop as we go along, not too quickly. They should be considered and well thought out processes, but being flexible or ambulatory is I think a good thing, which is what Paul was saying. I encourage you to have a look at that presentation that's at that link. So I think we need to take the same approach to One Health, One Welfare, which I guess is kind of the iteration of health to welfare. Don't sweat the details. But actually, I just want to be, my provocative pieces, I'm not sure that actually what we're looking for is a progressive approach. I'm wondering whether it's an entirely regressive approach, where we go back to thinking about things the way Indigenous people have done for a very, very long time. And actually, we really give credence to that and elevate that type of thinking to, you know, the new kind of go-to. Not a scholar, there's a lot to work through in all of that conversation, but just to note that, you know, we're not working with new stuff here. An example of how Māori think about these things, and I think this is a really lovely example of the kind of more holistic way of thinking about welfare. So I've got a little arrow going there to health, which I'm suggesting sort of progress to welfare, and I'm wondering whether, you know, does that become well-being? I wonder, I'm not a fan of well-being, I just said that, but I do kind of look at it and think, When I think of my own well-being, I think about spirulinas and smoothies and nice music and, you know, the really hedonistic end of good welfare. So I can accept that it's potentially part of the spectrum. The way Māori, or life force, or the vital essence of being, was described to me was regarding water quality in a seminar that I was at, and this beautiful Māori wahine woman got up and said, we wouldn't be looking to improve water quality from this health metric for the water, whether it was macroinvertebrate index or turbidity, to being slightly less poor or slightly better. We'd be looking to restore the Māori of the awa. And what that means is to restore the actual life force, the essence of the awa, the river, to really have it thriving rather than just surviving or just merely improving one metric. And again, that really spoke to me, and I've told a lot of people that story. When you say restore the Māori of the awa in New Zealand, people get that that means something entirely different to improving water quality. It really speaks to a holistic way of thinking about things. Okay, so with all of that in mind, you're aware of these three circles, I'm quite sure, maybe not with my colours in them, but you will have seen the One Health, One Welfare circles before. I'm suggesting that maybe what we should be thinking about here is that they all need to be constrained by the global ecosystem, because ultimately without the ecosystem, nothing exists. And I think that developing policy within the individual circles is part of, again, why we've ended up with wicked problems, which I do promise we are coming to. I told you it was going to be a meandering journey. So here we are, our ethos. I've put all three there, so I don't want anyone to fuss about the details. As I said, joined up thinking. That's on our website. The other thing I just wanted to pause on briefly, and I see other people speaking about this too, is that we also have human behaviour change here as a key part of our approach. And I just want to give a nod to the very clever people who do this work, and I absolutely believe are a critical part of driving change. So as a scientist, give me the data and you will change my mind. However, that is not how most people's minds work. So someone said to me, scientists are about 3% of the population. Data doesn't change the minds of the other 97%. So logic bullying and data bombing is not the answer. We have to have these HBC chaps at the table to help us out. And in that wide group of stakeholders, Ellen, that you described, you didn't list human behaviour change specialists, but I'm sure you meant to add one in there. We absolutely need social science at the table too. Righto, so how does all of my preamble relate to wickedness, and how does it stymie wickedness? The reason I wanted to set up with the preamble is because, which is half of my talk, I might add, that's not really preamble, it's a significant part of the conversation. But the point is that wicked problems don't make sense. Well, they don't even exist if we don't think holistically. Because the reason we can't change wicked problems is because of all of the different impacts that they have across a whole bunch of different things or places or people or animals. It's certainly much easier not to think in systems and just to advocate and regulate for one thing. Just get in your silo and do a thing. And this is what I see happening in New Zealand often. We really struggle to cross boundaries and think about the impacts. You know, if we're thinking about the circles, to think about the impacts in a different one of the One Health, One Welfare circles. So an example might be putting fast-growing chickens in a barn. And historically, we've propped that up with that unsustainable, unhealthy, low welfare lifestyle with antimicrobials. Like, we know no one's winning in that system, but now the money's been spent on the infrastructure. The chickens grow quickly, there's an economic driver behind that, and we have affordable chicken on the shelves. That's a big system in order to tackle, and I would argue that that's another wicked problem that I could tell you a very good story about. It's not the one we're going to focus on. So my reason for spending the first period setting this out is that understanding that connectedness is everywhere and that it underpins our wicked problems is absolutely critical. And the irony is, if we disregard connectedness, we don't have wicked problems. We can just, as I said, we can just regulate in silos if we don't care about the fact that the welfare of the other things will also be affected. We can just push on and keep doing what we were doing. So to me, wickedness and connectivity, they cannot be distracted, although it would be easier just to ignore it. So here you go. Finally, I hear you say she's landed at wickedness, and we have. So what do I mean by wickedness? First of all, I want to say that not all farms in New Zealand are wicked. I'll be very clear about this. On the left-hand side there, we have a crop, fodder crop, a winter fodder crop, no mud. There's also not a lot of shade, I would add, but essentially these cows for this grazing system are doing pretty well. And on the right, we have a whole bunch of dairy cows under trees. So can't really complain too much about that. I also want to say that the vast majority of farmers really care a lot about the animals that support them and their families. However, we have managed to drive ourselves, policy ourselves, steer ourselves into some tricky situations that are now really difficult to get out of, even if you do care about the animals and the environment. And it's also not all animal agriculture, right? We've created monsters like this. I'm sure they're very nice dogs, don't get me wrong, but what were we thinking when this happened? I've been a companion animal vet, and I'm very thankful that I never came across the dog on the right or the left for that matter. But oh my word. Or the difference between a 1950s, I think it was, bulldog on the left and one that won Crufts show not so many years ago. Again, we just need to look at that and think, how did we get here? This is maybe not quite such a complex wicked situation, but there's a whole bunch of dynamics behind this, right? From breeders to the guardians who still buy the dogs, to the prestige of winning a show, to the vets who continue to treat these dogs and patch them up and enable them to have offspring. So there's a lot of players in that supply chain, or that stakeholder group as well, that have enabled this to happen. Good news is, I just like to show this to say it's not all bad, but this is a true story. This dog, or this breed of dog in the Netherlands, got its nose back. It can be done. If we have, where there's a will, there's a way. And that included changing breed standards. And there was some regulation of things that happened too. And how cute is the one on the right? Okay, so what is a wicked problem? Again, I can't see your hands, but I posed that question before about how many people knew what they were. You could be Googling in the background and answering the questions. And you can do that, and you'll find that a guy, Horst Ritzel, I think his name was, came up with the idea. He had 10 metrics that he said, when these things happen, a problem is wicked. So I've just pulled out some of the key ones that are relevant to this conversation, but you can certainly find it. It was nothing to do with animal welfare. He was a design theorist or something in Germany, but it's very relevant to these problems that we've got ourselves into, certainly here in New Zealand. So firstly, there's many interdependent factors. And I just very briefly mentioned a few with the dogs before, and we're going to dive into that with some farming situations shortly. But those interdependent factors, because if you pull one lever, a whole bunch of other ones get affected, they seem really impossible to solve. And then he goes on to say that actually there is no single solution to the problem. And that's a really critical part of thinking our way through wicked problems, being able to create a change pathway or responses to start moving towards a different outcome. So he talks about these complex interdependencies. And somewhere he talks about, might be on my next slide. No, I might not have put it in. That doesn't matter. But yeah, solving and coming back to a little bit about what Ellen was talking about before with this wide stakeholder group and having diverse range of people at the table. One of the really critical things about solving wicked problems is getting a really deep understanding across a really broad range of stakeholders, and then taking an innovative approach to creating the change that we're looking for, including co-design. And again, I'm not an expert in co-design and those things, but there are people who are experts in that. And the other really good piece of news is that we don't have to start from the ground up to go, right, well, this is really tricky, how do we fix it? Because someone's already come up with the plan. Isn't that good news? So multiple steps. If we were going to put more simply, we're going to do a lot of talking, we're going to do a lot of thinking, and then we're going to do a bit of stuff. Then we're going to see what happens. Then we're going to regroup, and we're going to do more talking and more thinking, and then we're going to do some more stuff. And then we're going to do that over and over and over again. And that's essentially, that's one of the really important parts of what we need to understand about wicked problems, that piece I said where there is no one solution, right? So it's about making responses, creating movement in the right direction towards a different outcome, or the outcome that we think we're seeking. That also might change. And understanding that it's going to take a whole bunch of goes, a whole bunch of attempts to actually create the change. And we need to use human behaviour change to nudge people along to help, unpick and give them tools to be able to behave differently. And we need to be really clear that having to have multiple goes is not the same thing as failing. It's learning. One of the other words in Māori that I really love is the word ako, A-K-O. It means to learn and to teach all at the same time. And I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about things, because, and that's what we're describing here. Let's learn some things, let's implement them, let's be taught by the process, and then go back and do it all over again. And bring those human behaviour change champs with us. Sounds like they might be needed. All right, so if you Google it, you'll find lots of images and information about wicked problems. There's lots that are kind of quite good and quite informative and give various levels of detail about wicked problems and what you need to know about them. But bearing in mind the last 4 minutes of your life that you're not going to get back, that I just spoke about some of the metrics that are involved with wicked problems, the one I like best is this. It's very straightforward. What we see as a wicked problem is messy, interconnected, complex, and really difficult to untangle. That could also, in the days where we had wired headphones, that could be your headphones that you pull out of your pocket that are always in a knot. That is just one of the mysteries of life. Thank goodness for wireless earphone or earpods or buds, whatever you use these days. I want to make one point about the terminology. Problems kind of infer to me that there's a solution, and I've already said a number of times there is no one solution to a wicked problem. So I think they should be called wicked predicaments, where we think about predicaments needing responses, and as I've said, that might move us in a different direction and towards a different outcome and the one that we're seeking. We're not going to change the term. It's well embedded, but I just put that up there to go. I do think it's a bit of a misnomer as we've sort of thought through, kind of what a problem means or how we think about them, the way that triggers our minds to work. Again, human behaviour change, see, it's everywhere. Okay, and this is it. Remember that bit where I said that not all farms in New Zealand are wicked, and can I just please say that not every farm in New Zealand looks like this. Very important to understand. We have a lot that look a damn sight better than this. But here's a couple of examples of what I'm thinking about when I talk about wicked problems. So this is what's called intensive winter grazing, gone very, very bad, I might add. But it's a practice used in New Zealand to overwinter cattle. So an annual forage crop is grown every year. It's then grazed over the sort of 2 to 3 months in the middle of the year. And it's often grown in wet, cold areas where pasture growth slows down a lot. So they are looking for alternative food sources for these animals. And because we've had a massive dairy conversion, we now have also got quite a lot of big animals in those areas where we've got wet climate plus heavy soils, add in big animals, and this is just a recipe for mud. And this is the sort of disaster that we can end up with. So it's not hard to see, coming back to those frameworks that I spoke about, it's not hard to see why this is a one health, one welfare problem, right? A wicked problem or predicament. It's got bad outcomes for the animals. I don't think I'm going to need to explain that very much. We know, cattle do not like living like that. It's terrible for the environment. It destroys soil structure. We end up with a whole bunch of our topsoil running off into waterways. And the other thing that people don't really think about, but it's really stressful for people managing animals in these environments. And many of you will be looking at this and being absolutely, abjectly horrified, which you should be, because this is a particularly, these are bad images of this practice. But the other thing that has happened in New Zealand is that many, many animals now live during the winter, not in conditions as bad as this, but without pasture and not in barns, because this practice has become really, really common. And so it's sort of thought of now as our new normal. Again, not ones that look like this. That being said, there's a bunch of people who don't think it's okay and don't think it's normal, and there's often activist campaigns and people going around taking photos. So the farmers get really stressed about the fact that they're going to get, inverted commas, caught out, and it's really seriously anxiety-inducing for them. In addition, you know, remember I said before, I really believe most farmers really care deeply about their animals, that it's their livelihood. They understand that they're sentient beings, and looking at them living in these conditions, I mean, you'd have to be pretty unempathetic to not understand this. It's a pretty miserable way to live. So a bigger picture here, as far as the people side of things go, is that our consumers also care. Many of you will know that New Zealand is a huge part of our economy is propped up by our export revenue. So the people in our markets, external markets, also care about things like this. So this is a significant risk for New Zealand, and it's not just dairy, but a significant part of it does tend to be the dairy industry, but it is used in sheep and beef and deer systems as well. So animals, environment, and people being affected. This is an environmental picture. So for those of you who are not aware of things called ephemeral streams, you can see there's been some rain and all the little streams are flowing into a bigger one in the middle there. So they may not actually be streams on a dry day, but rain and the way the environment works causes these ephemeral streams to run and then delivers that topsoil into our waterways. Now that's really bad for a couple of reasons. That's topsoil, that is the business of farming, is to have topsoil. So that's now heading off to sea. Someone once jokingly said it's the largest export earner, or not an earner, but it's the largest export that New Zealand makes every winter. It's our topsoil going up to ocean. But it's also really bad because a bunch of it settles out, and maybe not in big waterways like that quite so much, but it settles out into the interstitium and smaller waterways, and then that kills all the little macroinvertebrates in the waterways. The nutrients, so things like nitrates and things that can leach into the water, they can allow for algal blooms. And also we now have concerns in New Zealand about nitrate contamination causing preterm births in women, low birth rates, and we seem to, there's an ongoing conversation about an increased risk of colorectal cancer from being exposed to nitrates. So this is 100% a one health, one welfare connected wicked problem that we're dealing with. On the other hand, we use these practices in dry, barren environments. I'm not going to focus so much on this, but I just wanted to say that it doesn't all happen in the wet, rainy bit. So this is up in the country where I grew up. So it's a very arid climate. And in this climate, one of the big concerns is there's no shelter, right? And this isn't necessarily in this area because they've been cleared of trees, which we're going to come to shortly. But certainly with no shade, no shelter, this is pretty challenging. So these soils are found in some of the hottest and driest parts of Aotearoa. And in many areas, we lift and shift water in order to make grass grow. Fair enough, we need grass to feed animals. But pivots, which I'm going to come to, and trees are not like peas and carrots. They don't go together well. So we've found in a number of areas across New Zealand that there's been a lot of trees taken out in order to put in these great big centre pivot irrigators to grow the grass, meaning the animals also don't have any shade. Now we know animals get stressed around 22 degrees plus a bit of humidity. It's been a really ongoing and significant challenge for us here in Aotearoa. A wee while back, I sat on a task force about the cows on mud situation. And one of the statements that came out, and this was around cows on mud, but I think it's relevant to a number of conversations. One of the task force statements was, firstly, it is clear to us that animal welfare is not sufficiently prioritised by anyone along the supply chain. We see this as a key barrier to adopting good or improved practice. And in line with this, trees have been taken out because it helps the grass grow, but we've completely deprioritised animal welfare in that conversation. Now, I understand why those decisions have been made. I'm just suggesting it's time to rethink that. And the real question becomes, how do we rethink that? Because they're really tricky. So a couple more examples there of similar things. You can see the big circles on the left-hand side. So that's where a centre pivot has been. And again, sediment running into a waterway. Okay, so another challenge might be, this is the only big large-scale feedlot in New Zealand. Again, no shade, no shelter, and it's pretty challenging underfoot, so a pretty barren environment. The scale is quite big. Those centre pivots that you can see on the right-hand image, those are up in the Mackenzie country here in New Zealand, and again, really dry, arid country. I just learned yesterday that the biggest, the widest centre pivot in that area is 2.4 kilometres in diameter. So that's a pretty significant, I mean, that's an incredible piece of engineering to be able to create something that does that, but it's a pretty significant bit of land. Now, again, I understand how we've got here. My question is, how do we now get ourselves out of this to have better outcomes for the environment, animals and people? And arguably these practices, you know, with no shelter, they actually are in direct breach of our Animal Welfare Act. In Section 4, Part B of our Physical Health and Behavioural Needs in our Animal Welfare Act, it states that animals need adequate shelter. And yet we find these situations in a lot of places across New Zealand. So again, there's another challenge there where another stakeholder, another player in the supply chain is our enforcement side, where these farms are non-compliant and yet nothing happens. Why is that? So I think I've talked about most of this, the impacts on animals, the environment being barren, no biodiversity. That's another big issue with all of the conversations going around about biodiversity. Another little bandwagon of mine is we should stop talking about climate change and we should start talking about ecological overshoot, of which all of these things are a symptom. Another conversation for another day, and the impact on people. So I've just got there the term moral distress. That's something that really resonates with me too. Veterinarians will understand what that is. Many caring professions understand moral distress that comes with jobs when you can't do what you know you need to do. And I genuinely think farmers probably experience this too. I just find it really difficult to believe that people who really care about their animals don't have feelings about the fact that they must know they're not providing the best for them, not giving them shade, that they're living on mud, for example. So one health, one welfare problem. I just chucked in these slides because if anyone's not sure what I mean when I say centre pivot, this is them. So they're great big long things. One of the good things is the cattle can go under them on a hot day, if that's where the grazing is happening at the time that the pivot's going. But they can cover vast areas. In the upper right-hand picture there is the centre of the pivot. I do like how they've put them up and had these beautiful vistas around them. There are some significant challenges with them too. Okay, so how did we get here? How did our animals end up living in this place? Why can't we make progress? We know what cows like to lie on. We know that cows like shade. We know that cattle don't necessarily want to be in a barren feedlot where they can't graze and forage and find shelter and shade from heat stress or cold stress. So I think multiple reasons why we've got here. I think there's some really big ticket items that have driven this over the last few decades. And some of that has been around our absolute focus here in New Zealand on a production goal, so more volume. And in that, we haven't considered the impacts on animals. So that driver of production and production alone, without thinking about welfare of animals, people, and the environment, I would add, has led to an intensified system where we have to take trees out so we can put pivots on to grow more grass. Again, I understand the drivers, and I will just say that farmers are responding to the situations that are put in front of them. We had a government who, back in the 80s, said, let's double exports. And that was, you might say I'm a little bit cynical here, but that was just a money, money, money and greed conversation. I'm not sure those are the only metrics we should be using. No, I am sure, actually, we should not just be using those metrics to judge our success. I've already mentioned the deprioritisation of animal welfare. Another MPI report around shade and shelter called the absence of shade and shelter stubbornly unchanging. But, you know, really, is it stubbornly unchanging? It is, it hasn't changed, but we need to go back a step and say, why is it stubbornly unchanging? There's been no drivers to change it because, as I said before, compliance doesn't come out and do anything about it. So farmers know that there's going to be no compliance action for not being compliant with our Animal Welfare Act. Ministries are being non-compliant with administering our Animal Welfare Act. Nobody's getting them in trouble. So there's no impetus for the change to happen until we collectively, as society, as the supply chain, as the wider social group, say, actually, enough is enough. And I do really wonder whether it takes those sorts of things to drive change. It's also very difficult when you've spent all of that money on a pivot, all that capital expenditure, to go, well, what happens if I have to plant a tree? What happens then? Right? These are really big conversations. Just aware of time ticking on, so I'm just going to just want to run you through one example. So thinking about either winter grazing or having no shade or shelter, to say, how did we get here? What is the supply chain? Who's part of this? Not finger pointing. Remember, I said that at the start. There are a lot of people and a lot of organisations that are involved. But let's say we start off with getting a mortgage from the bank. That mortgage is tied to a budget that is given based on advice from experts. So from farm sector organisations, rural professionals, that's most likely to be tied to productivity, as I just talked about. And that means more animals on farms because you get volume up, and intensification. And that means because we're producing more from the land value goes up, or it went up significantly from the mid-1980s to now, particularly the dairy conversion land. So farm conversions, which were required back in the day, slowing down now, and water allocation are regulated by our local authorities, so our devolved local government rather than our central government. And that has massive impacts on the environment, some of which breaks our laws, causes ill health to us and to our people, and yet those consents have still been afforded to people. And that system allows for growth. So we've got GDP and success. You know what I think about that as a measurement of success, but that's the way it's looked at. So that's on a national level. The system props up our GDP and our export revenue and our quality of life. And on a local level, the farming family's prosperity is absolutely dependent on the system, right? Because they got the mortgage at the bank based on the advice from the rural professionals, etc. And it's being able to pay off that mortgage and stay solvent that feeds their family. Again, perfectly legitimate. The community's prosperity relies on that family's prosperity. Farmers go buy fertiliser, they engage other rural professionals, vets, they buy seed, they go to the shops, they service cars and they buy tractors. So it's all tied together, and that supports overall New Zealand's economy. And yet there's a whole bunch of our law that we're not enforcing, whether that's environmental or animal welfare. And as I said, should have been clicking my buttons, I apologise, that farmers are part of a long supply chain of that story that I just spoke about. Sorry to rush you through that bit because I forgot to push the buttons. Very briefly, I realise I'm slightly over time now and I've got about a minute to go. So how big is this problem? I mean, surely we've got all these challenges, surely we just fix it, right? It's the obvious answer, just fix it. If we talk about winter grazing and those cows that live on mud, I don't really have figures for shade other than to say someone said about 80% of farms may not be compliant in New Zealand all of the time. We don't have a good figure for that though. But with winter grazing, there's about 1 million hectares of seed that is sold annually that is planted out, and about 500,000 hectares of that goes into those cropping systems. And then the really problematic bit where we've had the worst outcomes is only about 60,000 hectares. Now that's still quite a big number, but compared with 1 million hectares, that part of the system, even though it's only 60,000 hectares, props up all of the rest of the farming hectareage in New Zealand, right? So even though it's the problem that we see that I've just showed you is a tiny piece, it is actually the wider system that it supports that is the real crunch. It contributes to and maintains the lifestyle of a whole bunch of New Zealanders because of the dynamics I just spoke about in creating our prosperity for our country. So it's pretty wicked, right? Interconnected. Where do you start? 2 seconds on regulation to say we can't fix this by regulating at the end because of all those dynamics we just spoke about, right? You can't just wait onto a farm and say to the farmer, shift those cows. They've got nowhere else to put them. You can't go on and say, give them shade. There are no trees. So this regulation at the dead end, on the farm end at this point, is a useless mechanism in my view. And regulation actually only if you're a good lifer. It's only the bottom end anyway. It's what we should be looking for is creating a good life where things are thriving. Okay, so I had 2 slides on solutions because I didn't just want to be the the bearer of bad news. But coming back to how we deal with wicked problems and human behaviour change, to my mind, and what Ellen said at the start, this is all about getting a collective group of people together who understand, agree, and know that we just simply have to do something about this. We need it to be co-designed. We need wide engagement. We've got to understand where we're going. And for us in New Zealand, in my view, one of the things that we need to talk about is the difference between profit and production. We can have profitable farms with less production, and it would be better for the animals and better for the environment. And we need proper leadership. We've got leadership, but it's been pretty poor leadership. I wouldn't say no leadership, because I think farmers have been very clearly led to where they've ended up. It's just not, in my view, the right place. There will be a place for reactive solutions. So that is always going to be the case, so a little bit carrot and stick. But as I said, I just don't think that regulation is the first step here. Okay, so summary: one health, one welfare to our Māori. The world is connected, and that matters if we're going to think about wicked problems and not creating perverse outcomes as we try to address them. We need the human behaviour change champs at the table. We need to not ignore the problems. We've got to dive in. And by doing that transparently, we retain social license to operate, which was absolutely critical. These are kind of big things, right? We've got to do things differently, and that's through this co-design mechanism. That's what I think stymies progress.
Thanks very much, Helen. That was excellent. So, I mean, as Alan said at the beginning, this meeting was designed as a platform to help better understanding and improving communication and knowledge translation. So sort of try and drive meaningful changes in animal welfare globally. I think that was a perfect way of starting. So I've asked for questions in the chat. I can't see anything yet, but while people are thinking, I did have one question. So obviously in the talk, you highlighted a number of different challenges in implementing animal welfare. Do you have, and again, the answer to this may well be no, sadly, in a lot of ways, but do you have any examples of sort of successful initiatives or any kind of cases, I guess, where some of these challenges were effectively addressed? You know, something that actually led to meaningful changes in animal welfare?
Do you know what, Matt? I wish I was being overrun with ideas right now. That's not how it works. Yeah, look, I do have a couple. So back in about 2015, there was what we call the bobby calf expose here in New Zealand, and a bobby calf got put in a glass jar and put on a billboard in London, and it, you know, it was this big expose campaign. Within 9 months of that happening, we had new regulations in place, and this was a problem that had been just pushed aside and pushed aside. It was exactly one of these things. Everyone's saying it can't be fixed. It's too hard. It'll make, you know, farms will go bank, etc., all of those things. Within 9 months, we had regulations in law, and they materially changed the outcomes for bobby calves, like the death rates for bobby calves going on trucks and things. The graph is it's quite incredible to watch over the next few years. And actually around the mud issue, I did a whole bunch of advocacy on this when I was at the Veterinary Association, and the minister responded and set up it wasn't just me, that made me sound very important. It was a whole team of people who did that, not just me, but set up a task force, and we essentially ran that process of wide stakeholder engagement and co-designing and understanding all the different levers and figuring out a few things that could be moved. It's created some change. It hasn't solved the whole problem, but it certainly has moved the dial. So, you know, it can be done. We've got to be brave. That's the other thing. These are hard conversations.
Thanks. So we've got, excuse me, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. One is quite long, but I'm going to read it out. Carbon payments are an attempt to solve a wicked problem like this based on the assumption that value of impacts on the global ecosystem will only be considered in policy if they have a number attached. Do you feel that systems for payment of other ecosystem services could help integrate the costs of ecological impacts and policy making in farming, or do you see there are disadvantages in assigning a number of these factors that aren't always considered? Did that make sense?
It does. That's a great question. I need a whole presentation to answer it. But I think the short story is the purist in me says we ought not need a financial incentive to do the right thing by our sentient animals. You know, like I'm such a animal welfare advocate / activist. Like I just think if we're going to be using these animals, then we have to do right by them. Our social license in the end will dictate that anyway. And to be honest, getting an incentive payment over the line for improving something like animal welfare, I think would be nearly as difficult as actually just fixing the problem in the first place, because it is deprioritised in so many conversations. We've got biodiversity over the line, you know, there's, as this person has just noted, around carbon, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I just say let's just implement our law and provide a pathway for farmers to understand how to create change and get what we need, and make sure that's fair and just as we get there, because this is a multi-decade conversation to resolve some of these things. I mean, our economy, I mean, Kate may have views on that, but I think our economy is 100% propped up by some of these practices, so we got to be careful.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only the economy, but also how it affects people's sort of day-to-day lives in terms of, you know, money they've got in their pocket and so on. It's economies in terms of everyday life often.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
So we've got some other questions. Any comments on how to enroll farmers into activism without making them a target for colleagues? That's an interesting question.
You could put vets in that category too, to be honest. Actually, I don't. It's a real challenge here. So we're in the middle of running a massive campaign here on livestock exports, and I saw your comment there, Ellen, and I completely agree. Some of those pictures look similar to a livestock export boat. We really struggle to get farmers to come forward and champion that cause, even when they're absolutely passionate about the fact that we shouldn't be exporting livestock by boat. And it is the same around these conversations with mud and shade. They are so reticent to be putting their necks on the line, which I kind of understand. It's really tricky, right? Like you get judged and picked on, and you know, it's a hard space. I think it becomes that snowball thing, right? Like once you've got enough people and the safety's there, but it's getting the groundswell and getting the critical mass in the first instance to speak up and be brave enough to be in that space, then it becomes easy. But getting those leaders is really tricky. Or they just, you know what, the other thing, and I would see this with a bunch of our young farmers here in New Zealand, they've kind of given up with the system and they're just off doing their own thing and doing a good job, but just sort of disengaging from the broader conversation.
Thanks. So there's one other question as well. Somebody asked, do you have any thoughts on how wild animal welfare might fit into this predicament?
I do. Yeah, so again, talking about language and how important words are, like I really, first of all, we need to stop talking about pests. So we have a lot of conversation in this country, and there was some fairly challenging articles written by, I forget the name, I've lost it now, but about our Predator-Free 2050 campaign and the kids that we get going out and killing what they call pests as part of that process. There's a balance to be had here, right? I wish every animal, if it wasn't in the right place and it needed to be killed for reasons that we think it needs to be killed, it probably doesn't think the same thing, that it gets a high welfare death. And at the moment, we just don't have those tools here in New Zealand. So that would be the platform off which I answer this. If it has to die, it needs to be high welfare. And then I'm also we have a cat challenge here in New Zealand. I love cats, but if I had to choose between a cat and a kiwi, I would choose a kiwi every day. You know, like they are our taonga species. And I think when we've introduced animals that are creating impacts on our natives and so on and so forth, then, you know, it's our responsibility to kind of step up and do the right thing too. So high welfare, get them in the right place, and please don't, you know, could we go back and like unintroduce a whole bunch of things that we thought were a good idea?
Perfect. Excellent. Well, at 1 minute two, I think that's a good time to leave it, because we want to get ready for the next speaker. So, again, thank you ever so much, Helen. That was a fantastic talk and a really great start to this workshop. And yeah, I think it sets out a really nice platform for a lot of the challenges that we face, and yeah, and helps to frame a lot of the concept of what we were trying to do with this workshop.